Before we begin the video, if you enjoy what I'm doing here on High Americana, please head on over to Patreon, linked down below, to help support the channel, where you can also request content to be made. At $3,000 a month, this will become a full-time job. Thank you very much. And now, a passage from The Romance of the Boundaries by John T. Faris, from Chapter 12, The Story of the New Hampshire Grants. Which state of the Union was for 14 years an independent republic? To that question, many people will be inclined to reply that there was no such republic. Others would speak of Texas. But Texas was an autonomous republic for but 9 years. Then what state was it? And how did the strange thing come about? The reply gives opportunity to recount a story of backwoods bravery and pioneer sagacity that stretched over a period of more than 40 years. As early as 1724, the attention of sturdy pioneers was drawn to the attractive lands in the vicinity of the Connecticut River to the north of Massachusetts. In that year, a settlement was made at Fort Dummer on the present site of Brattleboro, Vermont. Now and then there were scattering attempts to go to the upper valley of the Connecticut, but fear of the Indians deterred many others from following the example of these early brave men. In fact, the demand for the valley lands was so small that it did not occur to New Hampshire and New York to lock horns as to the title to them. Then came 1749, when Governor Benning Wentworth of New Hampshire felt that the time was ripe to assert claims to lands he wanted for his own people. In a letter to Governor Clinton of New York, he said that while war with the Indians long had prevented the making of grants in the country along the Connecticut, he thought that the time had come to respond favorably to the frequent applications for grants of land, since he could do this in accordance with instructions secured from King George II. Since many of the applications were for lands in the neighborhood of New York, he wrote, "I think it my duty to apprise you thereof, and to transmit to your Excellency the description of New Hampshire as the King has determined it in the words of my commission, which after you have considered, I shall be glad you will be pleased to pen me your sentiments in that manner. It will affect the grants made by you or preceding governors, it being my intention to avoid as much as I can, consistent with His Majesty's instruction, interfering with your government." Further information was given in the letter that, by His Majesty's direction, a surveyor had run the western line from 3 miles north of Pawtucket Falls, and the surveyor upon oath has declared that it strikes Hudson River about 80 poles between where Mohawk's River comes into Hudson's River, which I promise is north of the city of Albany. With extreme courtesy, a request was made. Would Governor Clinton tell Governor Wentworth how far north of Albany his territory went according to the King's commission, and how many miles to the eastward of Hudson's River, to the northwest of the Massachusetts line? The information was desired, so said Governor Wentworth, that I may govern myself accordingly. The information desired was forthcoming. On April 3rd, 1750, the Governor's Council of New York decided to tell Governor Wentworth, who claimed territory to a line 20 miles east of Hudson's River, that the province of New York is bounded eastward by Connecticut River. The claim was based on the language of the patent given by Charles II to the Duke of York. Now, this letter did not reach Governor Wentworth in season to keep him from granting a township 25 miles east of Albany, which later became Bennington. When the governor of New York made accusation of undue haste and breach of faith in giving a grant contrary to his promise to refrain from infringements on New York claims, the answer was made that after waiting a reasonable time for a reply, action seemed justified. Then followed the request by New York that the dispute as to boundaries be laid before the king. Wentworth agreed, but he declared that it would be impossible to concur in the New York demand that the grant already made at Bennington be vacated. Although the two colonies decided to exchange copies of their appeal to the king, Governor Wentworth, instead of responding in kind when he received Governor Clinton's papers, replied with an argument against the position of New York. Some 4,000 words were expended in the futile setting forth of New Hampshire's claims. The correspondence thus begun was still going on when renewed war with the Indians took the minds of people in both colonies from the question of new lands and their settlement. But lost time was made up after the Indians gave opportunity to the land-hungry to go into the Connecticut country. A New Hampshire survey for a distance of 60 miles up resulted in the laying out of townships 3 deep on both sides of the river. Soon, 108 grants had been made in the territory claimed by New Hampshire, bounded by a line 20 miles east of the Hudson and north to the east shore of Lake Champlain. Came March 15, 1763. A merchant, after his return to New York City from a trip to Canada, made oath that in the month of September last he made a short stay at Crown Point, and there saw a considerable number of persons, about 5 or 6, among which were 2 gentlemen said to be powerful men in the New Hampshire government. That these persons declared that they came thither to lay out lands, and a man that appeared to be a principal person among them declared that Crown Point was in their government. The first result of the disturbing news was a proclamation made on December 28, 1763, by Lieutenant Governor Cadwallader Colden of New York. In this, New York's claim to the Connecticut as her eastern boundary was reiterated. Orders were given to civil officers of New York to exercise jurisdiction as far as the banks of the Connecticut River, the undoubted eastern limits of that part of the province of New York. No attention was to be paid to grants made by New Hampshire to the westward of that river. More, the High Sheriff of the County of Albany was ordered to report the names of those who held grants from New Hampshire in the disputed territory. Proceedings were to be instituted against them according to law. It was easy to issue a proclamation defying New York. This was done by New Hampshire on March 13, 1764. Those holding the grants were encouraged to cultivate their lands, biding with confidence their time of vindication. New Hampshire civil officers were told that they must be diligent in exercising their rights and in defending the holders of grants, in spite of the pretended right of jurisdiction mentioned in the proclamation from New York. New York claimed the next blood. Her appeal to the king brought a decision in accordance with the New York claim. But in the meantime, there had been more than one clash between the authorities of the rival colonies. On August 17, 1764, Sheriff Schuyler reported to Lieutenant Governor Colden, "Last Friday morning an express arrived from Hosek, acquainting that the New Hampshire people had turned Hans Jury Krieger, an inhabitant under the proprietor of Hosek's patent, out of possession of his lands and tenements, drove off his cattle, and took off with them a parcel of Indian corn, and for the redemption of his cattle compelled him to pay $45. When 2 others were similarly dispossessed, New York's officers arrested those from New Hampshire who were responsible and took them to jail in Albany. These and similar acts led Governor Wentworth to ask for the release of the men arrested. His contention was that it was not fitting individuals should suffer in a dispute between 2 governments as to jurisdiction. Then he sent word to the settlers in the grants to obey the authorities and laws of the colony of New York pending final judgment by the king. Action by the governor of New York was prompt. He formed the New Hampshire grants into 4 counties and demanded that those who had been occupying grants from New Hampshire should pay for new grants from New York. This caused great indignation, especially because, while the New Hampshire charge had been but $100 for a township, New York demanded $2,000 or even more. Many refused to pay, and action for ejectment was brought in the New York courts. The people of the grants were not ready to yield. Those on the west side of the Connecticut held a convention and decided to send Samuel Robinson of Bennington to the king to tell of the sorrows of the pioneers on the Connecticut. The sequel seemed to be a victory for the owners of the grants, for on July 24, 1767, a royal order was sent forth. His Majesty doth hereby strictly charge, require, and command that the governor or commander-in-chief of His Majesty's province of New York, for the time being, do not, upon pain of His Majesty's highest displeasure, presume to make any grant whatever of any part of the lands described in the said report, until His Majesty's further pleasure shall be known concerning the same." That seemed plain enough until the New York Provincial Council extracted the teeth of the order by declaring that the order merely said that New York must not grant lands which had already been granted by New Hampshire. It would be perfectly proper to grant lands not hitherto granted by New Hampshire, though in the territory in dispute. But this was not enough. The council said also that in the courts copies of the royal order to the governor of New Hampshire could not be received as evidence. This seemed to the recipients of New Hampshire's favor to sound the death knell to their hopes of receiving justice. Now read a few sentences by a modern dweller in Vermont on the disillusionment of these desperate men in the courts. With nothing but their inherent human rights back of them, the Vermonters went down to Albany. No true Vermonter can abide the name of Albany since then, and there went through the solemn twaddle of a law trial, where the standards were not those of human rightness and fair dealing, but were drawn from yellow parchments. Of course, the parchments won. That is their habit in law courts. Ethan Allen was in Albany through the trial to help the Vermonters. After the decision was rendered, he walked out of the law court on his way home, surrounded by a mocking crowd of York State men. The whole history is so familiar to us Vermonters that any one of us would know just what is coming next in this episode. When, in speaking to a Vermont audience, you begin this story, you can see people lay down their umbrellas and handbags to have their hands free to applaud, and you can see every backbone strengthen as you go on in the phrases consecrated by time. They shouted jeeringly at Allen, "Now, do you know you're beaten? Now, will you lie down and give up?" Allen drew himself to the full height of his magnificent manhood, we never use any less fine a phrase than this, and cried out in a ringing voice, "The gods of the mountains are not the gods of the plains," and strode away, leaving them silenced. Here is where the speaker always has to wait for people to get through clapping. He strode back to Vermont and organized a resistance. Was there ever a more absurd, pitiable, pretentious attempt? A handful of rough, ignorant mountaineers without a legal leg to stand on to try and defend themselves against the British law, and their only pretext, the preposterous one that they had earned what they held. At Bennington, the people decided to support their rights and property in the New Hampshire Grants against the usurpation and unjust claim of the governor and council of New York by force, as law and justice had been denied them. When New York surveyors attempted to run a line across the Grants, they were met by men under the lead of Ethan Allen, who severely chastised them with twigs of the wilderness, though the twigs were in reality heavy beech rods. These rods were used many times in succeeding years, and the operation of applying them became known as giving the beech seal. The story of the next year would seem almost laughable, but for the intense earnestness of those who took part in accusation and counter-accusation, in forays and defenses, in defiances and expressions of the disregard of one party for the other. Finally, committees of safety were organized in the towns in the Grants. A convention of representatives from the various committees decided on courses of action, and a military force was provided to carry out the decree of the committees. Ethan Allen, the commander of the new force, called them the Green Mountain Boys. This name was chosen because the governor of New York had said he would drive those who opposed him to the Green Mountains. Allen, his 4 brothers, and other officers became so obnoxious to the governor of New York that a price was put on their heads in 1771. This led to Ethan Allen's offer of £15 reward for the delivery of a certain 2 officials from New York at the Catamount Tavern in Bennington. The records of the activities of Allen and his Green Mountain Boys are among the most interesting of the stories of the days of the pioneers. Sometimes the New York authorities seem to have the better of them, but usually the laurels rested on the heads of the men of the mountains. Once, when Governor Tryon of New York asked the commander-in-chief of His Majesty's forces in the colonies to order troops to Ticonderoga and Crown Point to aid the civil authorities against the holders of the grants, the reply was a decided negative. He declared he would not use regular troops to suppress a few lawless vagabonds. When the General Assembly of New York offered £100 for the capture of Ethan Allen and £50 for the arrest of 6 of his associates, Allen made proclamation, "We are under the necessity of resisting even unto blood every person who may attempt to take us, for in this case it is not resisting law, but only opposing force by force. Thus far, the New Hampshire settlers are reduced to the disagreeable state of anarchy and confusion, in which state we hope for wisdom, patience, and fortitude, till the happy hour His Majesty will be pleased to restore us to the privileges of Englishmen." Then came the events which led the inhabitants of the Grants, in common with all other freedom-loving colonists, to oppose the yoke of Great Britain. Of course, all local quarrels were forgotten in the necessity for the common defense. The Green Mountain Boys turned their attention to Ticonderoga, as Ethan Allen told the story later. Directions were privately sent to me from the then colony, now state of Connecticut, to raise the Green Mountain Boys, and if possible to surprise and take the fortress of Ticonderoga. On May 9, 1775, we arrived in the evening opposite Ticonderoga with 230 valiant Green Mountain Boys, with great difficulty secured boats to cross lake. Early in the morning of May 10th, we surprised the garrison of Ticonderoga and summoned the commandant to surrender in the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress. Many insist that Allen did not use these words, but he said he did speak them. Following the capture of Ticonderoga came the taking of Crown Point, and the command of Lake Champlain was in the hands of the colonists, only to be lost a little later and regained at great cost. Congress, gratified, voted payment to the victorious Green Mountain Boys and recommended to General Schuyler that they be enrolled in the regular army for the defense of America and that they serve under officers chosen by themselves. To his disappointment, Ethan Allen was not made lieutenant colonel as he wished, but he was willing to serve otherwise. When his old command went to Canada, he engaged in various efforts against the British and was finally taken captive. Considered a bandit rather than a regular soldier, he was taken in irons to Falmouth, England, where he was a prisoner under trying conditions for many months. Encouraged by Congress's appreciation of the Green Mountain Boys, the inhabitants of the Grants decided at Dorset on January 16, 1776, to ask Congress for recognition, declaring their willingness to do all they could for the common cause, though it was impossible for them to act under the direction of New York. In the following July, a convention at which 32 towns were represented perceived the report of the message to Congress that the petition had been tabled. Herman Allen, the bearer of it, had thereupon asked to withdraw it, lest New York representatives should vote to take it from the table in the absence of a representative from the Grants. Thereupon the convention adopted a paper addressed to Congress. We, the subscribing inhabitants of that district of land, commonly called and known by the name of the New Hampshire Grants, do voluntarily and solemnly engage, under all the ties held sacred amongst mankind, at the risk of our lives and fortunes, to defend by arms the United American States against the hostile attempts of the British fleets and armies until the present unhappy controversy between the two countries shall be settled. On January 15, 1777, a Declaration of Independence was adopted. We will at all times and henceforth consider ourselves as a free and independent state, capable of regulating our internal policies in all and every respect whatsoever, and that the people of said grants have the sole and exclusive and inherent right of ruling and governing themselves in such manner and form as in their own wisdom they shall think proper, not inconsistent or repugnant to any resolve of the Honorable Continental Congress. Furthermore, we declare by all the ties which are held sacred among men that we will firmly stand by and support one another in this our declaration of a state, and in enduring as much as in us lies to suppress all unlawful riots and disturbances whatever. Also we will endeavor to secure to every individual his life, peace, and property against the unlawful invasion of the same. Lastly, we hereby declare that we are at all times ready, in conjunction with our brothers in the United States of America, to do a full proportion in supporting the just war against the tyrannical invasion of the ministerial fleets and armies, as well as any other foreign enemies. The new state was to be called New Connecticut. This name was changed in June 1777 to Vermont. That declaration was adopted at the historic courthouse in Westminster, where early in 1775 resistance had been offered by a company of young men to New York's attempt to open the Court of Common Pleas. The sheriff and 60 men drove out the defenders of the courthouse at cost of some bloodshed, but soon the tables were turned by aroused men from the neighboring Grants, who arrested the instigators of the attacks and sent them to jail in Massachusetts for trial. That ended the power of both the king and of New York in the Grants. When Congress received the petition from New Connecticut that it be ranked among the free and independent American states, New York protested. The delay of Congress in granting the request for recognition did not deter the people of Vermont. In July 1779, they adopted a constitution based on that of Pennsylvania, notable, among other things, because it was the first state document to forbid human slavery. The first governor had been elected in 1778, and the legislature had begun its session. Efforts to secure recognition continued, but new obstacles were placed in the way by the favorable construction given to the application of towns in New Hampshire to be taken into Vermont. So New Hampshire became an opponent of favorable action by Congress. Massachusetts joined the ranks of opponents because it seemed a good time to her to set up a claim to the southern portion of Vermont's territory. Ethan Allen, who had returned from England after his trying captivity, wrote a curious pamphlet which he called Vindication of the Opposition of the Inhabitants of Vermont to the Government of New York and the Right to Form an Independent State. This document sent broadcast made many friends for the struggling state. Finally, it was declared that the state of Vermont existed independent of the United States and was accountable to itself alone, since liberty was the gift of God. The contest continued throughout the war. The story of the bare events of the years, the necessity of raising troops by Vermont for her own defense, the renewed controversy with New York because of the receptions of towns from that state which asked to be included in Vermont, the later giving up of these towns, the bitter feelings and the hopes and fears of the people of the old grants is too long to tell here. It is enough to say that when the Treaty of Peace was signed in 1783, the territory of Vermont was part of the freed land, but it was not a part of the country as recognized by the colonists. By that time, Vermont was not so much concerned. She was a republic. She had a governor, a legislature, a constitution, a post office department, and even copper coins of her own, which bore the inscription in Latin, "The Republic of the Green Mountains." But the time came when Congress was ready to make overtures to Vermont, which was enjoying her freedom from burdensome taxes. To her enemies in Congress were added 4 southern states, which did not like to see encouragement given to an independent state for fear of the effect on their people, who had tried experiments in republics like Watauga, Transylvania, and Franklin. Pennsylvania was opposed for a similar reason. Her western people might be encouraged in the dreaded setting up of a trans-Allegheny state if Vermont received encouragement. But curiously enough, New York ceased to oppose the entrance of the new state into the federal union. Some thought this was because the vote of Vermont would aid in holding the national capital in the North. At any rate, overtures were made to Vermont to enter the sisterhood of states on certain conditions. The proposition was submitted to an assembly at Bennington on January 6, 1791. By a vote of 105 to 3, the proposition was accepted. Delegates were sent with the news to Congress, which on February 18, 1791, unanimously admitted the 14th state. Thus, the Republic of the Green Mountains, after 14 years of independence, became the state of Vermont.